It appeared as though everything had been decided behind her back. Her son, along with his new partner, had settled into the mother's apartment, while the former wife was relegated to different lodgings to live out her days. The mother-in-law arrived with suitcases and declared with unshakable confidence, quote zero, she was utterly convinced of her righteousness. Greetings, dear listeners. It's a pleasure to welcome you to my channel. I present to you a new and captivating story. Enjoy your listen. Alice had always sensed that Jana Borisovna was no ordinary woman. However, for the initial months following her wedding, her mother-in-law maintained a dignified distance, occasionally calling Artyom to inquire about his well-being. A couple of times she visited with a cake, a warm smile gracing her face, asking about his work and future aspirations. Alice even started to believe she'd been fortunate, that all those cautionary tales about mothers-in-law were merely urban myths. Artyom was renting a 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts, not far from the metro station. The neighborhood was lively, but the dwelling itself was quite respectable, furnished, complete with appliances, and even a dishwasher. They shared the rent. Alice worked as a manager at a construction firm, earning approximately $70,000. Artyom, a freelance programmer, earned a bit more. They had enough for everything: rent, groceries, and weekend outings to cafes. Their life was peaceful, modest, yet comfortable. Alice dreamed of owning her own place. She diligently set aside $10,000 each month into a separate savings account. Artyom supported the idea, though somewhat passively. He often remarked that a mortgage was a form of servitude and that it would be better to save for another couple of years. Quote one, he'd say. Alice didn't push the matter. There was time. Jana Borisovna resided in the city center, in a grand Stalin-era building with high ceilings. Alice had visited once for her mother-in-law's birthday. The apartment was magnificent: polished parquet floors, ornate stucco moldings, and enormous windows. Jana Borisovna proudly led her guests through the rooms, showcasing an antique sideboard and a crystal chandelier, recounting how the apartment had been inherited from her parents back in the 80s. Artyom had grown up in this very apartment. And then there was another 2-bedroom unit in a residential district, smaller and more modest. Jana Borisovna rented it out, bringing in around $40,000 monthly. This income covered utility bills and minor expenses. The first sign of trouble appeared in November. Artyom came home from work looking somber, sat at the kitchen table, and remained silent for a long time before finally saying, "Mom has met someone." Alice was pleased. "That's wonderful. She should live for herself. She's not old yet." Artyom nodded, but his eyes lacked joy. "She wants me to move in with her." "Well, that's fine, and she's offered me the second apartment, the one she rents out." Alice froze, her teacup suspended mid-air. "Move in, you mean us?" "Yes," he confirmed. "She says, why waste money on rent when there's an empty place?" "Artyom, that apartment is occupied. There are tenants." "Mom will evict them. She's already warned them. She says she needs the apartment for her son." Alice gently placed her cup down. "And what about the rental income? She was receiving that money." Artyom shrugged. "Well, she won't be receiving it anymore, but we'll save on rent. We save, and she loses income." "Alice, she's my mother. She's trying to do what's best for us." Alice remained silent. A knot tightened in her chest. She disliked it when outsiders interfered in her and Artyom's lives. But she didn't object. It was his mother, his apartment, his decision. They moved in December. The apartment turned out to be quite decent. 2 rooms, a kitchen, freshly renovated. However, it was sparsely furnished: a sofa, a table, a couple of chairs. They had to buy a bed, a wardrobe, and appliances. Alice contributed half of her savings. Artyom also pitched in. Jana Borisovna attended their housewarming, surveyed the rooms, and nodded. "You've settled in nicely. Just don't forget to pay the utility bills." Alice offered a strained smile. Artyom promised to transfer the money each month. Jana Borisovna left, content. For a while, everything ran smoothly. Artyom dutifully paid his mother for the utilities, around $5,000 in the winter and less in the summer. Alice kept quiet, though a storm brewed within her. Previously, they paid $35,000 for their rented apartment, and now they were paying only $5,000 for utilities, yet they had invested over $200,000 in furniture and appliances. The savings seemed dubious, but Alice didn't argue. She simply continued to save money, accumulating for her future, for her own home, for independence. In February, Jana Borisovna began visiting more frequently. At first, it was once a week, ostensibly to check if everything was in order with the apartment. Then twice, then 3 times. She would arrive unannounced, unlock the door with her own key, enter and inspect the rooms, offering criticisms. Alice gritted her teeth and remained silent. Artyom would deflect with phrases like, "Jana Borisovna would feign hurt but would leave, only to return again." In March, the first serious conflict arose. Alice returned from work to find the furniture in the bedroom rearranged. The bed was now against a different wall and the wardrobe had been turned. In the kitchen, Jana Borisovna was mopping the floor. Quote 17, she said, without looking up. Quote 18. Alice stood in the doorway, speechless. Artyom was engrossed in his laptop, silent. Jana Borisovna finished mopping, wiped her hands, and looked at her daughter-in-law. Quote 19. Alice turned and retreated to the bedroom, locking the door. She sat on the bed, the newly rearranged bed, and wept from helplessness, from humiliation, from the fact that Artyom hadn't even defended her. That evening, he sat beside her. "Alice, don't be upset. Mom just wanted what's best." She entered our bedroom and moved the furniture without asking. "But it's her apartment. And what are we here? Tenants." Artyom sighed. "Don't start. Mom is stressed. Things aren't going well with that man. She's taking it out on us." "Artyom, this is our life. I'll talk to her, I promise." He either didn't talk to her, or his words had no effect. Jana Borisovna continued her visits. Now, she came with bags bringing groceries purchased during sales, kilograms of potatoes, cabbage, cheap sausages. Alice tried to explain that they bought their own food, but her mother-in-law merely waved her hand. Quote 25. The provisions would accumulate in the refrigerator. Potatoes would sprout, cabbage would wilt, sausages would spoil. Alice would discard them, and a week later, Jana Borisovna would bring another batch. Artyom remained silent. In fact, he had become generally silent. More and more often, he retreated into his work, his laptop, his headphones. Alice felt a wall growing between them, cold, invisible, yet impenetrable. In April, Jana Borisovna parted ways with her man. Alice learned of it from Artyom, who stated curtly, quote, 26. It became tough for Alice as well. Jana Borisovna began visiting daily, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening. She'd sit in the kitchen, drink tea, and complain about her life, about men, about her health. Artyom would listen and nod. Alice sat beside him like a mannequin, forcing a smile. One day, Jana Borisovna stayed the night, simply declaring she was too tired to travel across town. She slept on the sofa in the living room. In the morning, she woke up before everyone else, prepared breakfast, and roused Artyom. Alice awoke to sounds from the kitchen. She emerged to find her mother-in-law bustling about, frying eggs, humming. "Good morning, Alice," Jana Borisovna chirped. "I've made pancakes. Have a seat." Alice silently poured herself some coffee and retreated to the bedroom. After that, Jana Borisovna started staying over more often, once a week, then twice, then 3 times. She acquired her own slippers in the hallway, her own bathrobe in the bathroom, her own mug in the kitchen. Alice felt she was losing control, that the apartment was ceasing to be her home, that she was merely a guest. She tried to talk to Artyom. "Your mother is staying here more than at her own place. Alice, she's lonely. And how do you think I feel? Just bear with it for a while, she'll calm down." She didn't calm down. In May, Zhana Borisovna announced that her apartment in the center required repairs, that the pipes were leaking, plaster was peeling, and it was impossible to live there. She moved in with them temporarily, she said, for a month, 2 at most. Alice understood this was the end. That _quote_32_ meant forever, that Zhana Borisovna would never leave. Her mother-in-law occupied the living room, unfolded the sofa, arranged her belongings, and hung a childhood photograph of Artyom on the wall. Alice silently observed this domestic resettlement. Artyom helped his mother with her bags, hanging curtains, connecting a floor lamp. Alice stood aside, her fists clenched. Her life had become a nightmare. Zhana Borisovna woke up at 6 a.m, clattering dishes, turning on the television at full volume. She prepared meals that Alice disliked: greasy soups, pearl barley, pasta with sausages. She lectured on how to properly wash floors, do laundry, and iron shirts. She made remarks in front of Artyom. _33 Artyom remained silent. Alice started staying late at work, returning home when Zhana Borisovna was already asleep. She left early before her mother-in-law had woken up, but completely avoiding encounters was impossible. One evening, Alice returned to hear unfamiliar female laughter from the living room. She peeked inside. On the sofa sat Zhana Borisovna's friend, a plump woman with dyed hair. They were drinking tea, eating cake, and discussing some television series. "Ah, Alice, come meet my friend Nina Semyonovna," Zhana Borisovna said. "We're having a little get-together." Alice nodded and went to the bedroom. She sat on the bed, her hands trembling. She realized she couldn't take it anymore, that something had to be done. That night, she told Artyom, _36. He looked at her, surprised. _37, _38, _39, _40, _41. The word struck her like a slap. Alice turned to the wall, no longer discussing the matter. June was sweltering. Alice grew thinner, paler, her eyes vacant. She stopped cooking. Zhana Borisovna always found something to criticize anyway. She stopped cleaning. Her mother-in-law would redo everything her way. She stopped talking. Words lost their meaning. Artyom seemed oblivious to what was happening. He worked, earned money, spent evenings with his mother in the kitchen, listening to her stories. Alice had become background noise to him, silent, convenient, unobtrusive. In July, Zhana Borisovna began removing Alice's belongings from the apartment. First, her cosmetics, too many jars cluttering the bathroom. Then books. They collect dust. Then clothes. Why so many rags? You don't wear them anyway. Alice would return from work to find her possessions packed into boxes in the corner of the bedroom. "I've tidied up," Zhana Borisovna would say. "One must live in cleanliness." Alice remained silent. She had learned to be silent. In August, something snapped. Alice woke up in the middle of the night and realized she was no longer afraid, angry, or distressed. She simply felt nothing. Emptiness filled her completely. She got up, dressed, took her bag, and left the apartment. She rented a room in a dormitory, a tiny space with a shared shower on the floor, for $15,000 a month. She texted Artyom, "I need time." He replied 3 hours later, "Okay." For 2 weeks, Alice recovered. She slept 12 hours a day, ate when she pleased, watched series, cried, laughed, cried again, then calmed down. It became easier. Artyom called a couple of times, asking, "How are things?" Alice answered briefly, "Fine." He didn't press, didn't ask her to return, didn't apologize, simply accepted that she had left. At the end of August, Alice realized their marriage was over, that there was nowhere to return to, that Artyom had made his choice, and it wasn't her. She went to the apartment in the afternoon when no one was home. She packed her belongings, clothes, documents, laptop, and left the keys on the table. She intended to leave, but then stopped. She opened a drawer, pulled out a utility bill, an old one from June. She looked at it closely. The owner's name, Zakharova Alisa Grigorievna. She had purchased this apartment 3 years prior before meeting Artyom with her own money. She had taken out a mortgage for part of it and received assistance from her parents for the rest. She paid diligently, cleared the loan, and initially rented it out, but then decided to keep it as a backup. She lived in a rented place while keeping this one just in case. When Jana Borisovna offered for them to move in, Alice didn't bother to explain that it was her apartment. Why? Artyom was so pleased. "Mom is helping, we'll live for free." Alice remained silent. Let him think it was Jana's. It was simpler that way. Alice paid the utilities herself, from her card via the app. Artyom transferred money to his mother. Jana Borisovna believed she was receiving rent for the apartment. In reality, it was merely pocket money from her son. Alice didn't object. Let mother and son believe they were in control. Now she picked up the bill, folded it, and placed it in her bag. She left the apartment, closing the door. A week later, she filed for divorce. Artyom didn't resist. The divorce was finalized quickly, without any drama. Jana Borisovna didn't even find out. Her son didn't tell her. Alice returned to the dormitory, continued working, saved money, and contemplated her next steps. In September, Artyom met a woman named Ksenia. She was 5 years older, divorced, with a child. Artyom liked that. She was independent, didn't demand attention, and didn't create scenes. They dated for 2 months, and then she moved in with him. Jana Borisovna was initially indignant, but Ksenia proved resolute, stating curtly, Quote 51, Jana Borisovna scoffed but agreed. Deep down, she was even pleased. Ksenia turned out to be amenable, controllable, unlike Alice, who was perpetually sulking and silent. The mother-in-law relocated to the city center. Artyom did indeed help with the renovations, hiring a crew and purchasing materials, spending around $200,000. Ksenia paid half. Jana Borisovna was content. A month passed. Life in the center settled down. Jana Borisovna met another man, a respectable individual with an apartment and a car. He courted her elegantly, took her to the theater, and brought her flowers. She blossomed, and then something unexpected happened. The man proposed they live together. Jana Borisovna agreed. He said, Quote 52. Jana Borisovna was taken aback. Quote 53. He shook his head. Quote 54. Jana Borisovna pondered and remembered the second apartment, the one in the residential district where Artyom and Ksenia were living. She could ask them to move back. After all, she was their mother and they should understand. She called Artyom, explained the situation, and asked him to vacate the apartment. Artyom paused, then said, Quote 55, Jana Borisovna insisted. Artyom wouldn't budge. So, she decided to take matters into her own hands, packed her suitcases, took the keys, and went to her son's. On a weekday morning, while both were at work, she opened the door, entered, placed her belongings in the hallway, and looked around. Nothing seemed to have changed, except for children's toys in the corner, from Ksenia's child. Jana Borisovna sat on the sofa, pleased. They would arrive in the evening, and she would explain everything. Her son would understand. Ksenia might protest, but what could she do? The apartment wasn't hers. In the evening, Ksenia arrived with her daughter, saw Jana Borisovna and the suitcases, and stopped. What's going on? Jana Borisovna smiled. My dear Ksenia, I'm just staying here for a little while. I've met a man and he wants to move in with me. So I thought you and Artyom could stay in my apartment in the center for now. In your apartment? Yes, it's spacious and comfortable. You'll like it there. Ksenia slowly put down her bag. So, you want us to leave here and move in with you? Precisely, it makes perfect sense. Ksenia looked at her for a long moment, then pulled out her phone and dialed. Artyom, your mother is here with suitcases, saying we have to leave. Jana Borisovna nodded complacently. That's right. He'll explain everything. Ksenia listened, frowning, then handed the phone to her mother-in-law. He wants to speak with you. Jana Borisovna took the receiver. My dear Artyom, I've explained everything. I have a man and I need the apartment. You'll move to the center. You'll be happy there. Mom, that's not your apartment. Jana Borisovna laughed. How is it not mine? Of course it's mine. I gave it to you when you married Elisa. Mom, that apartment belongs to Elisa. She bought it 3 years before our wedding. You were just renting it out until we moved in. No. Wait. Artyom's voice faded. It seemed he was just beginning to grasp the significance of Elisa's statement. Mom, the apartment is registered to Elisa. She's the owner. When we divorced, she didn't kick me and Ksenia out. She just asked us to pay utilities and not make a mess. I thought you knew. Jana Borisovna slowly lowered the phone, looking at Ksenia. Ksenia stood with her arms crossed, a smirk on her face. I can call Elisa if you'd like, Ksenia said. She's actually in the process of arranging the rental officially. She wants to go through an agency. Artyom and I have agreed to rent from her for $35,000 a month. That's the market rate. We're perfectly happy with that. Jana Borisovna couldn't utter a word. Her vision blurred. She sat down on her suitcase. Ksenia continued. Jana Borisovna raised her head. Quote 7-8. Ksenia took her daughter's hand and walked into the bedroom. Jana Borisovna remained seated on her suitcase in a foreign apartment, which now felt doubly foreign. She tried calling Artyom. He declined the call. She texted him. My dearest Artyom, I didn't know. Please forgive me. He didn't reply. Half an hour later, a taxi arrived. Ksenia had called it. Jana Borisovna silently gathered her belongings and left for her apartment in the center, which was indeed hers, but no longer seemed so grand. Alice learned of this that evening. Ksenia messaged her, recounting Jana Borisovna's visit. Alice laughed for the first time in months. Thank you for not letting her in, Alice texted back. It's your apartment. I'm just living here, Ksenia replied. Live peacefully. I'm glad Artyom is with you. You handle things better than I did. You handled them in your own way. Alice turned off her phone and went onto the balcony. The city sparkled with lights. Somewhere out there in the residential district, other people lived in her apartment. Artyom with his new wife, who hadn't been afraid to put her mother-in-law in her place. Alice didn't feel envious. She was simply glad it was all over. 3 months later, Alice paid off her mortgage early. Having saved enough and adding her bonus, she cleared the loan. The apartment was entirely hers. She decided to sell it, too many memories attached. She quickly found buyers, a young couple expecting a child. Alice handed them the keys, received the money, and bought a small studio apartment on the other side of town, new, clean, and unburdened by the past. In winter, she coincidentally met Ksenia at a shopping mall. They greeted each other and had coffee. Ksenia mentioned that Artyom was doing well, that Jana Borisovna no longer imposed herself and was living contentedly with her man. And you? Ksenia asked. Fine, Alice replied. Truly fine. Ksenia smiled. You know, Artyom once said you were right, that he had let you down. He said, uh-huh. I replied that better late than never. They finished their coffee and parted ways. Alice stepped outside. It was snowing, a light, fluffy, festive snow. She turned her face to the cold flakes and thought that sometimes silence is more valuable than words. There's no need to explain, to prove, to fight. One simply needs to wait, and at the right moment present a bill with your name in the owner's field.